Hello, Natural Resources. Today we are going to start looking at the parts of a tree, and trees actually seem to be pretty um, simple objects, but there is a lot that's actually going on inside of the tree that we don't actually see happening. So we're going to look at the basic parts of the tree and the functions of those things. So as we start at the bottom, obviously, sometimes you can see these and sometimes you can't. There are some trees where you can actually see some of the roots that are out along the ground, but for the most part, you don't actually see this part of the tree. Most of the roots are actually going to be dug down into the soil. But you can see on this particular picture, a lot of your hardwood trees are actually going to have what we call fibrous roots, and so they're not going to dig too deep into the ground, and they're actually going to kind of go out along the ground the way that these have, and they're not going to dig too deep. Um, and then you also have got tap roots, which is more like your pine trees, and those are pretty much going to dig deep into the ground, but not outward like a fibrous root system would. So the roots are actually there to anchor and support the tree. So a lot of times, if you have a flooding type of issue or a heavy wind type of issue, the roots that you're going to see, the trees that you're going to see blown over, are typically going to be those that have got those shallow fibrous root systems, and you'll actually see the whole root ball come up with the tree when it blows it over. Normally, if you see something like a pine tree, you don't see a pine tree uprooted, and that's because the roots go so deep into the soil. Usually pine trees, if they're going to be damaged during a storm, actually break off instead of being uprooted. So the roots are going to help to take in the water and the nutrients for the soil. They actually have these little things on them called root hairs, and the root hairs are tiny, almost microscopic, and that's going to be what actually helps to absorb the nutrients and the water from the soil around it. So it has to be in a liquid form in order for it to be taken up by the tree. So that's why it's so necessary for trees to have plenty of water. The roots themselves are going to help to hold the soil in place, and they also help to improve the soil quality because they're putting organic matter into the soil. And so, anytime that you are in an area where there are things that are planted, typically that's going to make the soil more rich. It's going to make it more nutrient dense because those roots are there, and sometimes as they are growing and then dying and decomposing, then they are actually adding lots and lots of nutrients to the soil. The good thing about roots as well is they actually serve as a storage system for the tree. So, what's typically going to happen is you're going to have soil, or not soil, but water and nutrients that are going to be taken up in these roots into the root hairs. They're going to be taken up the trunk, and then they're going to go up into the canopy where the leaves are, and in the leaf section of the tree is where photosynthesis is going to happen, and that process of photosynthesis is actually going to be what's making food for the tree. And so you've got the water that's coming up. You're also adding the carbon dioxide from outside. All this happens in the presence of sunlight, which is kind of like your oven for this whole part of the experiment. And then what you get in the end result is going to be sugar, and sugar and oxygen. And oxygen is basically just going to be a byproduct. It's just going to give us back oxygen to be able to breathe. And that sugar, that glucose, is going to be what's actually going to be used as the food for the plant. So once it's made up in the leaves, it's actually going to come back down the trunk, and all that sugar is actually going to be stored down in the roots. So it's going to be protected from weather and all that type of stuff. So it's kind of a process where you've got things going up the tree, food is made, food comes back down the tree. So it's kind of like you're sending your ingredients up into the leaves. The food is made in the leaves, and then the finished product is being brought back down for storage in the root area. The trunk itself, it does support the crown, which is that canopy. It's the leaves and the branches and all that kind of stuff. But really, the trunk, more than anything else, is a transportation system. You have different types of tissue inside of a trunk. You have the xylem and you have the phloem. And the xylem, and this is how I remember which is which. I think about xi high, flow low. The xylem is going to be what takes things higher into the tree. The xylem is going to be the type of tissue that is going to take your water from the ground up into the tree, up into the canopy. It's going to make the food. Once the food is made, then it's going to get back on that transportation system in the trunk, and it's going to go flow low through the phloem, and it's going to go back down into the trunk of the tree. So two major pieces of tissue or types of tissue that you have in the trunk: xylem, phloem. Xi-high is going to take things up higher into the tree from the roots to the leaves, and phloem, flow low is going to take things from the top and move them lower into the root area. So basically, the trunk is going to be a transportation system. And I kind of think about it like an interstate. When you're on an interstate, you don't have cars going all which way. You have one northbound lane and one southbound lane. And so, or east and westbound lane, whichever way you're going. So you have one lane that's taking things up the tree, one lane that's taking things down the tree. And they don't ever mix, because if they ever mix, then you have a wreck, and that's a problem. So the thing that happens is, as this is going on, the rings are being created within the tree. And so the xylem and the phloem are actually what's creating the rings that you see whenever you count rings within a tree. So you think about when you cut a tree down and you count the rings, you're trying to figure out how old that tree is. And basically, every ring is that particular year's part of xylem and phloem. And every year they're going to produce new xylem and phloem, and that's why you have the rings in your trees. So let's take a look at some of the parts of the trunk. If you were to cut down the tree and you were specifically looking at a tree trunk from what we're looking at from the outside, you can't really see all these parts when we're looking from the outside. But if we were to cut it and we were to look at a cross section of the tree, you would see these different parts. So the first, I'm gonna start from the inside out. The heartwood is actually going to be the oldest part of the tree. So this is the wood that was there first. This is what was there whenever the trees were young. This is going to be darker in color. And normally it's darker in color because the sap's just been there longer. And the sap, as the tree gets older, the sap is in the tree, it gets stickier and harder. And this heartwood part of the tree is going to be a very hard piece of lumber. So if you cut down a big tree and you see a really dark ring or a really dark part in the middle, that heartwood is going to actually be very hard wood inside the middle of the tree, just because it has so much sap in it that has aged and hardened over the years. The next part is going to be your sapwood, and that's actually the wood that's kind of along the outside edges. So, all of these rings have been xylem and phloem, and as they age, they become harder, and they become closer to being heartwood. The sapwood is actually what's on the outside. The tree is actually growing from the outside. So the sapwood itself is going to be outside of the heartwood. It's going to be lighter in color. This is where things are actually moving still. So if you kind of think about this older part of the tree, it's done its part. This newer part of the tree is where all the movement is happening. You're going to have a layer of xylem and you're going to have a layer of phloem that are going to be in that particular sapwood area, and they're going to be what's actually doing the transporting throughout the tree. The cambium is going to surround, the sapwood, and this is what adds to the phloem. This is what helps to add new tissue to the tree. So it's kind of like you say, well, how does all that happen again? You've got all these different rings in the tree, and the different rings in the tree are actually going to be created by this cambium itself. That's what creates the phloem in order to be able to increase the width and the girth of the tree. The inner bark, this is all this bark stuff, whether it's inner or outer bark, is old phloem. Okay, so all of this inside is going to be old xylem. All of this is old phloem, and it just helps to be able to protect the tree. So when we're looking at the inner bark and the outer bark of the tree, it's there to help protect it, and it's the part of the phloem that actually is bringing things from the leaves back down into the roots. So if we were to actually look at the growing portion of the inside of a trunk of a tree, you've got it starts out here. This is where your oldest stuff is, and this is your oldest, and you can see all this older xylem material. The younger stuff is on the outside. The cambium is going to be what creates those rings and layers, and then you have phloem. You've got younger phloem, older phloem, and that's what's going to be protecting the outside portion of your tree. So for me, I love this picture. There is nothing that is more relaxing to me than to be outside and look up at the canopy of a tree. And I'm not really sure why, but I love to do that. So for me, the tree provides provides a shade, but it's also kind of a peaceful, calming feeling to just look up at the top of the tree and see the sunlight shining through it, and know that there's work that's going on inside of that tree while I'm just standing there. So the leaves themselves in the crown, and all these, hanging on these limbs and branches, are going to be where all the food processing is taking place. So the leaves are more or less the chemical factory for the tree. They're taking this carbon dioxide that we breathe out. Every day we're breathing out carbon dioxide. Every minute we're breathing out carbon dioxide. But we can't breathe carbon dioxide back in. It has to be transferred back into oxygen for us to be able to take it in. And plants are going to be what does that. So basically, this tree is taking in the carbon dioxide that we're breathing out, and it's sucking up the water from the ground. And that water and that carbon dioxide are going to sit in those leaves in the process of, or in the presence of chlorophyll, which is what makes the leaves green. And that sunlight is going to be kind of like the stove, and it's going to make this chemical process happen. Once it does, then you end up with sugar, which is this C12H12O6 or C6H12O6, this sugar, and it also gives off oxygen because, we kind of need that in order to be able to breathe. So the excess water from the tree is going to be able to evaporate, and it's kind of like a breathing process for the tree. And that process is called transpiration, and that's what we were talking about before, that actually helps to cool down things in the forest. So as these trees are actually giving off this water vapor, it's helping to cool things in the forest, and that's why you can walk from outside in the hot sun and into a forest, and it's immediately cooler and more refreshing. So the functions of the crown, that's just where the photosynthesis is going to be. You've got branches and twigs and bugs and a lot of buds, and a lot of times you have things living in those trees as well. The seeds and the fruit and the nuts and the berries are all going to be produced in the crown. So those are the different parts of a tree. We will spend some time looking at the different parts of the tree if you are in cohort A or B, and then hopefully soon we will actually start to do some tree identification. That will be the next part of this PowerPoint presentation. Your next section will actually start looking at some different types of trees and being able to identify them. So if you have any questions, please make sure that you reach out to me, and I will talk to you next time.